D4, knight F6, knight F3, G6, bishop G5, bishop G7, knight B D2, D5, C3, castle kingside, E3, knight C6, bishop D3, rook E8, castle kingside, E5, D takes E5, knight takes E5, knight takes E5, rook takes E5, bishop F4, rook E8, H3, C6, rook E1, queen B6, queen B3, knight D7, bishop C2, knight C5, queen A3, bishop F8, B4, knight E6, bishop G3, A5, queen A4, bishop G7, B takes A5, queen takes A5, queen takes A5, rook takes A5, knight B3, rook A8, rook E2, bishop takes C3, rook D1, rook takes A2, H4, H5, bishop D6, knight G7, bishop F4, knight F5, bishop D3, rook takes E2, bishop takes E2, knight takes H4, rook C1, bishop F6, knight C5, knight F5, bishop D3, knight G7, knight A4, knight E6, bishop G3, B5, knight B6, knight D8, knight takes C8, king G7, knight D6, rook E6, knight C8, bishop E5, bishop takes E5, check, rook takes E5, knight A7, rook E6, bishop takes B5, C takes B5, knight takes B5, rook B6, knight D4, knight E6, rook D1, knight takes D4, rook takes D4, rook B5, G3, king F6, king G2, king E5, rook F4, F6, rook A4, rook B6, Rook D4. Rook C6. Rook A4. Rook C4. Rook A5. H4. G takes H4. Rook takes H4. Rook A6. Rook C4. King F3. G5. King E2. Rook C2 check. King F3. Rook C4. King G3. G4. King G2. F5. Rook A8. Rook C3. Rook E8 check. King D6. Rook F8. King E6. Rook E8 check. King F7. Rook E5. Rook C5. Rook takes F5 check. King E6. Rook F4. Rook C4. Rook D4. King E5. King G3. Rook C3. King takes G4. Rook C1. Rook F4. Rook G1 check. King F3. Rook E1. Rook H4. King D6. King E2. Rook E2 check. King F3. Rook E1. Rook H6 check. King C5. Rook H5. Rook F1.